Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. If you travel into the limestone valleys of southwestern France, you will find Rocamadour, a medieval pilgrimage site clinging to a cliff face. Its chapels, stairways, and towers rise one above another, culminating in the sanctuary of the Black Madonna, a statue long venerated by pilgrims across Europe. Beneath it lies the narrow valley of the Alzou River, once filled with travelers on foot, horse, and cart. Rocamadour was a place of faith, commerce, and sound the tolling of bells echoing from stone to valley floor. Bells were central to medieval life. They marked the hours of prayer for monks, signaled the beginning of mass for townsfolk, and rang out warnings of fire, flood, or attack. Like pilgrimage shrines like Rocamadour, bells had special meaning. They announced miracles, called pilgrims to devotions, and symbolized divine presence. Records describe processions in which bells rang as offerings were presented, their sound carrying for miles. The bells of Rocamadour were not small handbells, but great cast bronze instruments suspended in timber frames high in towers. Casting such bells was a laborious process. Bronze had to be alloyed, molds prepared in clay, furnaces stoked, molten metal poured with care. Each bell was a feat of metallurgy and a financial investment. To own such bells was to display both wealth and piety. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Rocamadour thrived. Pilgrims came from England, Spain, and Italy, climbing the grand staircase on their knees. Inns, shops, and markets catered to them. Offerings enriched the shrines. The sound of bells became part of the town's identity, its peal inseparable from the echo of prayer. But history brought hardship. The 100 Years' War swept across France in the 14th and 15th centuries. English and French armies raided the region. Pilgrimage declined, revenues fell. Later, in the 16th century, the wars of religion divided Catholics and Protestants. Rocamadour's shrines were damaged, relics desecrated, and the town weakened further. Through it all, bells remained symbols of endurance. Then came stories of legend, half history, that during times of war or invasion, Rocamadour's bells were buried. Chroniclers speak of townsfolk lowering them from towers, digging pits, and burying them upside down, mouths to the earth. The reasoning was both practical and symbolic. Practically, bells were valuable bronze, could be melted into cannon or coin. To save them from looting, burial was a desperate defense. Symbolically, turning a bell mouth down silenced it, as if the town itself had closed its voice to the outside world. Archaeology and local lore suggest that more than once, bells vanished into the ground during conflict. Some later recovered, others lost. Legends say that on quiet nights, buried bells could still be heard ringing underground, the sound of memory rather than metal. For the people of Rocamadour, burying a bell was not simply hiding property. It was a ritual act, admitting that the sound of prayer and warning was no longer safe in public. It was an inversion of order, community silencing itself to survive. And so, we are left with an unresolved thought. When villagers sealed their bells beneath the earth, did they believe they would one day be lifted again to ring over pilgrims? Or did they think they were consigning the voice of Rocamadour to permanent silence? Asterisk to understand why a town like Rocamadour would bury its bells. You must consider what a bell meant in the Middle Ages. Bells were not just instruments of sound, they were symbols of identity, repositories of wealth, and, in the eyes of the faithful, vessels of the sacred. When a bell was cast, It was often christened like a child, anointed with holy water, and given a name. Parishioners processed with candles as priests blessed the metal. Inscribed upon its surface were invocations, prayers to Mary, crosses, and Latin phrases such as vivos voco, mortuos, plango, fulgura, frango. I call the living, I mourn the dead, I break the lightning. In a time when storms, fire, and war were constant threats, such inscriptions were more than decoration. They were believed to grant protection. Bells also carried immense economic weight. A large bronze bell might weigh hundreds of kilograms. To cast it required copper and tin metals, expensive and often imported. A single bell could represent the wealth of a parish accumulated over decades. In times of war, this value made bells targets. Armies melted them down into cannon, coinage, or weapons to a community. Losing a bell was not just a financial loss, it was the silencing of its voice. This helps explain why Rocamadour and other towns like it resorted to burying their bells. The act was both practical defense and ritual surrender. Lowering a bell from its tower was no small task. Ropes, pulleys, and scaffolding were needed. The entire community might participate, guiding the massive bronze down through narrow stairways or removing parts of the roof to lower it. Then came the digging pits large enough to swallow the bell, lined with straw or cloth to cushion the descent. Finally, the bell was inverted, mouth pressed into the earth. In this position, it could not be rung, nor easily dragged away. Written sources hint at such practices. In times of crisis, especially during the 100 Years' War, chroniclers noted bells hidden or silenced. Sometimes they were taken to caves or riverbeds, but more often, burial beneath the churchyard or fields was described. Folklore later embroidered the accounts, claiming that upside-down bells could still be heard tolling underground, their sound echoing faintly through the soil during storms or on holy days. For Rocamadour, the act carried deep symbolism. The town's fame rested on pilgrimage to the Black Madonna, and the ringing of its bells was part of that ritual experience. To silence them was to suspend the identity of the place. Imagine pilgrims arriving to find no chime announcing Mass, no toll for Vespers, only silence where once the air had rung with bronze. The absence itself must have felt like a wound. Daily life, too, was altered. Bells regulated time in an age before clocks were common. They summoned workers from fields, marked curfews, signaled the Angelus's prayer at dawn and dusk. Without bells, villagers turned to the sun, shadows, or sandglasses. Timekeeping became less communal, more individual. The soundscape of the town, normally punctuated by bronze voices, was reduced to footsteps, carts, and the rustle of wind in the valley. The burying of bells also intersected with fear. The 14th century brought not only war, but plague. In times of epidemic, bells tolled constantly for the dead. To silence them could be a mercy relief from the endless reminder of mortality. Yet, it also removed a spiritual comfort. Bells were thought to repel demons and storms. Inverting them underground was to admit that such protection was beyond reach. Archaeological discoveries across Europe confirmed these practices. Han villages in France, Germany, and Poland, buried bells, have been unearthed centuries later. Some were cracked from rough handling, others preserved intact. In Rocamadour's case, local lore speaks of bells buried during English raids and never recovered, though no definitive excavation has yet uncovered them, whether fact or legend. The persistence of the story reflects the cultural weight bells carried. Meanwhile, Rocamadour itself was changing. The wars of the 14th and 15th centuries reduced pilgrimage. Inns emptied, shops closed. Yet, the town remained a symbol, and its shrines continued to attract visitors, especially after peace returned. The bells, when restored to towers, rang again perhaps never with the same unbroken continuity. Each time they were silenced or hidden, something of the town's confidence was eroded. What fascinates historians is the deliberate inversion. Why upside down? Practicality is one answer. A bell inverted is harder to haul by ropes, its mouth filled with earth, its clapper immobilized. But symbolism also played a role. To turn a bell mouth down was to mute it completely. Bells were meant to speak to heaven, their sound rising above rooftops. It's planted in the soil. They seemed to speak only to the dead, their prayers silenced. It was an act of submission, acknowledging defeat before war or storm. And yet, in folklore, buried bells never quite lost their voice. Stories in the region claimed that on feast days, villagers heard them toll faintly underground, as if reminding the faithful that silence was not final. Some tales even suggest that bells would rise again when the time was right, resurfacing from the soil to reclaim their place in towers. Such legends reveal a psychological need, even in silence. The community clung to the idea that its voice was not lost forever. Rocamadour's bells, whether truly buried or only remembered as such, illustrate how communities faced crisis with both practicality and ritual. They show us that silence itself was a strategy, a way to protect identity by temporarily concealing it. The burial pits were not graves, but safes, holding bronze until it could ring again. And so we return to the central image, a bell, mouth down in the earth, heavy and mute. Was it hidden treasure, awaiting recovery? Or was it, for those who dug and lowered it, already a tombstone for a way of life slipping away? By the time Rocamadour entered the 17th century, its fortunes had shifted. The pilgrimage revived at intervals, noble patrons returned, and its chapels were repaired. Yet the memory of silenced bells remained part of its story. For villagers and pilgrims alike, the idea that bells had once been buried in times of danger shaped how they thought about sound, safety, and faith. When bells were restored to their towers after wars or crises, the act was itself a ritual. Parish records describe processions, blessings, and rededications. The lifting of a bell from the ground back into the sky was more than mechanics, it was a resurrection. Communities gathered, priests anointed the bronze, and children clutched candles as the ropes strained to haul the bell upward. When it rang again for the first time, it was as if the town itself had regained its voice. But bells that were lost forever became legends. Local lore around Rocamadour told of bells still buried beneath chapels or fields, their sound sometimes heard faintly in storms. Folktales claimed that if you pressed your ear to the earth, you might catch an echo. In this way, absence became presence. The buried bells were not forgotten, but reimagined as subterranean guardians, waiting. The symbolism deepened in Catholic thought. Bells had always been associated with the voice of the church, calling the faithful, repelling demons, sanctifying time. To bury them was a paradox, to silence the very instrument meant to guard and announce holiness. Yet the act also expressed resilience. A bell hidden was a bell preserved. Communities chose silence in the present to ensure sound in the future. This pattern repeated across Europe. In German towns during the 30 Years' War, bells were hidden from mercenary armies. In Poland, legends speak of bells lowered into lakes. In Spain, tales recount villagers burying bells during Moorish raids, only to find them centuries later when plows struck bronze beneath the soil. Rocamadour's stories fit within this wider tradition, part history, part folklore, part psychological. Archaeologists and historians caution us to read these tales carefully. Documentary evidence is rare, and actual excavated bells are few. Yet the persistence of the stories reveals cultural truth, even when material proof is scarce. For medieval people, the thought of a bell underground was powerful. It represented both loss and hope, silence and memory. In Rocamadour, the shrines endured, though never without interruption. Pilgrimage waxed and waned. Wars scarred the region, and the Black Madonna's chapel was rebuilt. Through it all, bells were lifted, silenced, and lifted again. The town's identity was braided with sound in its absence. Even today, visitors remark on the way bells echo against the cliff, a reminder that in this place, sound has always carried both weight and fragility. What lesson lies in Rocamadour's buried bells? Perhaps it is that communities survive not only by speaking, but also by knowing when to fall silent. To bury a bell was to concede defeat for a time, but also to protect the possibility of future voice. It was an act of humility before history's storms. And so, you are left with one last question. When a medieval town turned its bell's mouth down into the earth, was it protecting its past, or was it planting its voice for the future, trusting that one day the bronze would rise again and ring across the valley once more? Asterisk, in the late Middle Ages, the Flemish city of Ghent was one of the largest and wealthiest urban centers in northern Europe. Built on canals and fueled by the textile trade, it rivaled Bruges and Ypres as a hub of commerce. Its cloth halls bustled with merchants. Its guilds filled streets with banners, feasts, and processions. In a city of such wealth and pride, bells were more than instruments. They were symbols of independence and political power. Ghent's belfry, begun in the early 14th century, rose above the city as a declaration of autonomy. Unlike church towers, which belonged to the bishop or abbey, the belfry was the property of the citizens. From its top, guards watched for fire or invasion. In its tower hung bells that summoned guild members, told warnings, and proclaimed decrees. The largest, often called the bankloke or alarm bell, was a voice of the people. Bells mattered because they organized civic life. They rang to announce the start of markets, the opening of council meetings, the call to arms in times of revolt. Each bell had a name and a function. Some signaled curfew, others marked hours, others celebrated festivals. To control the bells was to control the rhythm of the city. This control was contested. Ghent, though wealthy, was subject to the authority of the Count of Flanders and, at times, the King of France or the Dukes of Burgundy. When tensions rose over taxes, privileges, or military levies, the bells became instruments of defiance. Chroniclers record episodes when citizens rang the great bell to gather militias against their lord's officers. To silence the bell was to suppress the city's will. The most famous of Ghent's bells was later nicknamed Roland in Flemish. Cast in the 14th century, it weighed several tons and hung in the belfry as the city's proudest possession. When Roland rang, its sound carried across fields and villages, announcing Ghent's authority. But Roland was also a target. Rulers who subdued Ghent sometimes ordered the bell removed, silenced, or even broken in moments of greatest danger. Citizens are said to have hidden or buried their bells. Legends tell of Roland being lowered and concealed to prevent confiscation by the Count's troops. Though historians debate the literal truth, the symbolism is clear. The people of Ghent saw their bells as too precious to surrender. Better to hide them than to let their enemies control their voice. Daily life in Ghent revolved around these sounds. Imagine walking its cobbled streets in the 14th century. Weavers at their looms, dyers stirring vats, barges moving down, canals. Over it all, the bells marked time, discipline, and civic pride. To hear them was to belong to Ghent. To lose them was to lose part of the city's soul. Thus, the story of Ghent's belfry is not only about architecture, but about the politics of sound. The bells were weapons in civic struggles as important as walls or militias. Their ringing could summon revolt or proclaim submission, and when threatened, citizens chose silence on their own terms, hiding or even burying their bells rather than allowing them to be turned against them. But here, the unresolved question arises. When Ghent's people hid their bells, were they protecting their liberty for the future? Or were they admitting that their voice could be silenced by force all the same? Asterisk, the story of Ghent's bells cannot be told without understanding how sound itself was political in the Middle Ages. In a city where thousands worked in cloth halls, guild houses, and markets, bells gave order to life. They were the clock before clocks, dividing the day into hours of labor, prayer, and rest. Yet, they also served as signals of resistance, summoning citizens to arms or protest. The Roland bell, cast in the 14th century, embodied this dual role. Its booming note was not simply a call to mass or market. It was the rallying cry of civic pride. When Roland rang unexpectedly, citizens rushed to the square, ready to defend privileges. For rulers, the bell was dangerous, could stir rebellion with a single peal. This tension came to a head repeatedly. In the late Middle Ages, Ghent clashed with the Counts of Flanders over taxes and autonomy. The belfry was both fortress and symbol. Chroniclers describe scenes where lords attempted to silence the bell by force, ordering it removed or broken. Each time, citizens resisted, sometimes hiding the bell or claiming it had been taken down for repairs. Legends grew around these episodes, blurring history with folklore. The Burgundian dukes, who absorbed Flanders in the 15th century, understood the symbolism. They allowed Ghent its belfry, but sought to control when Roland could ring. 1453. After the city was defeated at the Battle of Givard, Duke Philip the Good ordered the bell confiscated. To the people, this was more than humiliation. It was the silencing of their civic identity. Without Roland, Ghent's voice was muted. Some accounts claim that citizens hid smaller bells, burying them to prevent seizure, preserving, at least, fragments of their sound for the future. The struggle over bells was not unique to Ghent. Across Europe, rulers recognized that controlling sound meant controlling people. In Paris, the ringing of the Great Bell of Notre Dame could summon Parisians to defend liberties. In Florence, the campanile signaled votes and assemblies. Bells were more than religious, they were civic instruments, woven into governance. For Ghent, however, Roland remained central. The bell was recast in later centuries, restored to the belfry, and celebrated in song and legend. Its image appeared on seals and banners, a bronze guardian of the city's liberties. Yet, the memory of its silencing lingered. The citizens knew that their autonomy was fragile, vulnerable to the will of distant dukes or kings. Daily life under these conditions was marked by both dependence and defiance. Guild members rose at dawn to the sound of bells, worked long hours, and returned home under curfew peals. But the same bells that kept order could, in moments of crisis, become instruments of uprising. Sound was discipline. Sound was freedom. The decision to hide or bury bells when threatened was, therefore, deeply symbolic. It was not only about protecting bronze from confiscation. It was about refusing to let the enemy use the city's own voice against it. By silencing themselves, Ghent's people claimed a paradoxical autonomy. They would choose silence on their own terms rather than accept imposed mutinies. And so the question persists, was Roland's silence a defeat imposed by rulers? Or was it, in its own way, an act of resistance, proving that even in silence, the city still controlled its voice? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. By the early modern period, the great bell of Controlant had become more than an instrument. It was an emblem of civic pride, remembered in song, story, and law. Its fate illustrates how objects can transcend material reality and become symbols of identity, even when silenced. After the defeat at Givard in 1453, when Duke Philip the Good stripped Ghent of its privileges, Roland was reportedly removed from the belfry. Some sources claim it was broken, others say it was confiscated and melted for cannon. The truth may be a mixture. Large bells were often recast, their bronze reused, but their names retained. In any case, Roland, as originally cast, was gone. Yet, Ghent's citizens did not allow the memory to vanish. Within decades, a new Roland was installed, cast again, rehung in the tower, and celebrated as the same bell. Its continuity was asserted, even if the metal was different. This act naming the new bell after the old shows how symbols persist beyond their material form. For Ghent, Roland was not just bronze, it was the voice of liberty, the guarantor of civic order, the rallying cry of guilds. When recast, it was not seen as new, but as reborn, like a phoenix from molten fire. Bells, after all, were ritually christened. To give a bell the same name was to preserve its soul. The belfry itself, rising to over 90 meters, became the setting for this symbolic survival. Finished in the 15th century, it housed not only bells, but also the city's charters of liberty, kept in a chest guarded by guild representatives. Architecture, documents, and sound converged in one space, a fortress of identity. To attack the belfry, or to silence its bells, was to assault Ghent's autonomy directly. Daily life continued under Roland's tolling. 8. Merchants set market stalls at its morning chime. Weavers worked their looms by its hours. Carts knew to close gates when curfew rang. At weddings, bells pealed with joy. At funerals, they tolled solemnly. The rhythm of sound-ordered existence, binding private life too. Civic structure for villagers in surrounding countryside. Hearing Roland across fields was reassurance that Ghent stood firm, its liberties intact, yet the memory of loss was never forgotten. Each time the city entered conflict with Burgundian or Habsburg rulers, citizens recalled how their bell had once been silenced. Folklore grew, claiming that Roland had been hidden, buried, or carried secretly away, and that its voice could still be heard underground. The blending of history and legend reinforced the lesson. Ghent's freedom was fragile, its voice always threatened. In later centuries, Roland was joined by a carillon smaller bells, tuned to play melodies. These softened the tower's soundscape, adding harmony to what had been a single, commanding voice. But the great bell remained central, rung on special occasions and civic festivals. Its sound carried meaning across generations. Even today, Roland remains part of Ghent's identity. The current bell, recast in the 17th century and again in modern times, still hangs in the belfry. Tourists climb the tower to see it, and locals hear it during ceremonies. On the city's coat of arms, the figure of a roaring dragon crowns the belfry, another symbol tied to the bell's history. Said to guard its voice, the story of Ghent's bells reveals a broader truth about medieval and early modern Europe. Sound was power. Control of bells meant control of time, assembly, and identity. When rulers confiscated bells, they silenced more than bronze. They silenced communities. When citizens buried or hid bells, they engaged in quiet resistance, preserving their autonomy by denying enemies their voice. What does it mean, then, that Roland was broken and recast, silenced and reborn? Perhaps it shows that symbols cannot be destroyed so easily. Metal can melt, but memory persists. Communities carry sound in their minds, even when silence falls. Spells, once buried or lost, still ring in legend, their voices echoing underground or in story. And so the unresolved thought lingers when Ghent's people looked up at their belfry, hearing Roland peal across the city after centuries of conflict. Did they believe it was truly the same bell reborn, or did they know, quietly, that what mattered was not the bronze, but the memory of a voice that could never be silenced? Asterisk, if there was any medieval city that understood the power of bells, it was Novgorod the Great in northern Rus. Situated on the Volkhov River, Novgorod was not only a trading hub linking the Baltic to the Volga, but also a proud republic, governed for centuries by its Vech, a popular assembly. And at the heart of this civic life stood bells. The great Vech bell was no ordinary instrument. It hung in the courtyard near St. Sophia Cathedral, a massive bronze whose voice summoned citizens to assembly. When it rang, merchants, craftsmen, and boyars crowded into the square to debate laws, elect officials, or declare war. K. de Novgorodians, the bell was the republic itself, set sound the embodiment of civic freedom. Chroniclers wrote that the Vech bell was the soul of the city. Beyond the Vech, Novgorod was a city of churches by the 15th century, over 60 of them, each with its own bells. Some were small, marking parish life, others large, calling worshippers to St. Sophia or other monasteries. Pilgrims noted how the soundscape of Novgorod was filled with bronze voices echoing across the river and markets. Bells marked feasts, fasts, funerals, fires, and floods. They created rhythm in a city otherwise governed by snow, trade, and politics. Casting bells was itself an art in Rus. Craftsmen mixed copper and tin in great furnaces, poured molten bronze into clay molds, and tuned the bell by filing the inner walls. Each bell was unique, its tone shaped by weight, thickness, and metal content. Some bore inscriptions, prayers, or the names of donors. They were not only instruments, but also relics of civic and religious pride. Yet, Novgorod's independence was fragile. To the east rose Moscow, ambitious and expansionist. For centuries, Novgorod balanced between alliances, sometimes leaning toward Lithuania or other Western powers, resisting Moscow's growing dominance. Kells, symbols of liberty, became targets of conquest. In 1478, Ivan III of Moscow marched on Novgorod, ending its republic. Chroniclers describe how he confiscated the Vech bell, dragging it to Moscow, where it was hung as a trophy. To Novgorodians, this was more than humiliation. It was the silencing of their soul, where that once resounded with assembly was mute, its bell absent. But not all bells were surrendered. Legends tell of parish bells hidden during invasions, lowered from towers, buried in pits, concealed in marshes. Some stories say bells were dropped into lakes, their sound still echoing from the depths on feast days, whether true or folklore. These tales capture the desperation of a city unwilling to let its voice be stolen. Daily life after conquest was quieter, not only politically, but literally. The Vech was gone, its summons silenced. Parish bells remained, but their collective authority was diminished. Citizens adjusted, trading and praying as before, but always with memory of a lost sound. And so the unresolved question arises: when Novgorod's people buried their bells in soil or water, did they hope to preserve them for a future revival of liberty? Or did they know they were burying forever the voice of a republic that would not return? The conquest of Novgorod in 1478 by Ivan III was not only a political event, it was an acoustic revolution. Where once the Vech bell had called citizens to assembly, now its voice was stilled. The chroniclers emphasized this moment, describing how the bell was torn from its tower, dragged through the streets, and carried to Moscow as a symbol of subjugation. To take the bell was to take the city's freedom. The removal of the Vech bell left a scar in memory. The square in front of St. Sophia Cathedral, once filled with argument, debate, and collective decision-making, became silent. Assembly no longer gathered. Decisions were dictated from Moscow, embodied in bronze, now rang only in a distant capital. But Novgorodians did not forget their bells. Parish records and folklore alike suggest that other bells were hidden during this period, concealed to prevent confiscation. The burial of bells, whether in soil, bog, or river, was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it denied conquerors access to valuable bronze. Symbolically, it allowed the community to imagine that its true voice lay dormant, not destroyed. Legends grew around these hidden bells. Peasants in villages near Novgorod told of lakes where sunken bells tolled beneath the water. Travelers spoke of marshes where, on holy nights, the earth itself seemed to vibrate with sound. Though unverifiable, these tales carried a truth of another kind. They preserved memory. In the absence of real pills, imagination supplied them. The economics of bells reinforced their importance. Bronze was scarce and valuable. To cast a great bell required enormous resources. For conquerors, confiscating bells was pragmatic. They could be melted into cannon or recast as symbols of power. For conquered communities, burying bells was resistance, preventing enemy appropriation. A buried bell was wealth denied, identity hidden underground rather than flaunted as a trophy. Daily life after conquest reveals the quietness. Parish bells still rang for mass and funerals, but the soundscape of freedom was gone. No longer did the great bell call citizens to assembly. No longer could the people summon themselves with sound. Instead, bells rang only within the limits permitted by Moscow's authority. Silence was enforced, but also chosen. Communities that buried their bells silenced themselves to protect what they valued. What is striking is how memory persisted. Centuries later, when antiquarians collected local folklore, stories of buried bells remained vivid. Villagers swore that, in certain storms, sound of the vetch bell still rolled across the Volkhov, though no such bell hung there. The legend of the ringing from beneath was a way to insist that the soul of Novgorod had not been extinguished in time. New bells were cast, new towers built, and Novgorod became another provincial city within Muscovy. Yet the memory of the buried or stolen bell endured. To this day, the story of the vetch bell remains central to how historians understand Novgorod's fall. And so we are left with an unresolved thought. Did Novgorod's people truly believe that their buried bells would one day be unearthed, or did the very act of burial admit a tragic truth that their liberty had sunk beneath the earth, never to be heard again? Asterisk, after the conquest of 1478, Novgorod was never the same. Its independence was erased, its vetch bell carried to Moscow, and its civic voice silenced. Yet, the memory of bells lingered, shaping how Novgorodians thought about their past and their identity. The chronicles, written in Muscovy, celebrated the seizure of the bell. To Moscow, it was proof of conquest, the bringing of Novgorod into order. The bell, now rung in the Kremlin, was reinterpreted as a voice not of liberty, but of centralized power. What had once summoned free citizens now proclaimed the Tsar's authority. Metal remained the same, but meaning was transformed in Novgorod itself. Silence was heavy. Parish bells continued to mark births, deaths, and feast days, but the great civic sound was gone. Villagers told stories to fill the gap. Some claimed the vetch bell, instead of being taken whole, had been shattered and buried, its fragments scattered secretly across the land. Others said it had been thrown into Lake Ilmen, where its voice still rose faintly from the depths on winter nights. The persistence of these tales reveals how silence itself became part of memory. Archaeology has uncovered fragments of medieval bells around Novgorod, though none that can be definitively identified as the vetch bell. Still, the physical traces bronze, shards, mold remnants, inscriptions remind us how deeply bells were woven into material culture. They were not only civic voices, but also artworks inscribed with prayers, symbols, and donors' names. To bury or lose them was to lose both utility and beauty. Over the centuries, Novgorod adapted to new rulers. It remained a trading post, a center of icon painting, and a seat of the Orthodox Church. Bells continued to be cast from monasteries and parish churches. Yet, the memory of the vetch bell remained distinct. It represented a time of autonomy when citizens could summon themselves with sound. Later generations looked back with nostalgia, carrying in their minds the peal of liberty long silenced. In the 19th century, Russian historians rediscovered Novgorod's Republican past. Writers evoked the image of the bell dragged away as a symbol of lost freedoms. Poets and folklorists recorded peasant tales of bells buried underground, ringing invisibly. The sound of silence had become part of national memory. Today, in Novgorod, the great visitors can still hear bells ringing from St. Sophia and other churches. Replicas of the vetch bell stand as monuments. Yet, the original is gone, absorbed into Moscow's story. The legend of bells buried upside down, silenced but not destroyed, remains a metaphor for what was lost and remembered. The history of Novgorod's bells teaches a broader lesson, that sound can embody identity, and silence can wound as deeply as conquest. When a community buries its bells, it is not only hiding bronze, but also admitting that its voice must retreat into memory. And so, the question remains, when the people of Novgorod told stories of bells still ringing beneath soil or water, did they truly believe in subterranean sound? Was this their way of insisting that liberty itself, though silenced, was not dead, but only waiting to be heard again? Asterisk, the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, left much of Central Europe scarred. Its towns burned, fields abandoned, and churches ruined. Among the lesser-told casualties of that conflict were the bells, the bronze voices of parishes, monasteries, and cities. In this war, more than in almost any before it, bells were silenced, confiscated, buried, or destroyed. Why? Because bells were made of bronze, a material essential for casting cannon. As armies moved across the German lands imperial, Swedish, French, and countless mercenary companies, they demanded supplies. When treasuries ran dry, churches and towns were ordered to surrender their bells. Chroniclers record the scenes. Towers stripped, bells lowered with ropes, dragged away on wagons. Their peals replaced by silence. But not all communities complied. Some resisted openly, pleading with commanders to spare their bells. Others resisted quietly, hiding or even burying them. Bells were lowered under cover of night, concealed in fields or forests, sometimes inverted and packed with earth so that they could not be rung or recognized. In this way, towns tried to preserve what they saw, not just as property, but as identity. Consider daily life in a 17th century German village. The sound of bells marked time for farmers in the fields, craftsmen at their benches, children at their lessons. Bells tolled for weddings and funerals, for saints' days, and for danger. To lose them was to lose rhythm itself. A parish without a bell was like a body without breath. The war made this silence commonplace. Parish registers from the 1620s and 1630s often include notes that the bell was taken for cannon, or since the bell is gone. No tolling for the dead. Imagine families burying their relatives without the sound of bronze above them. A ritual absence felt as keenly as hunger. Some towns recorded specific acts of concealment. In Westphalia, villagers buried their bells upside down in churchyards, marking the ground with nothing but stones. In Saxony, peasants lowered small bells into lakes, believing water would hide them. In Bavaria, monastic records speak of bells hidden in cellars or bricked up in walls. Archaeologists have occasionally uncovered such caches centuries later. Bronze is forgotten, then rediscovered. The politics of bells was clear. For rulers, confiscating them was a necessity. Each bell might yield hundreds of kilograms of bronze, enough for several cannon. For subjects, hiding them was resistance. Better to silence one's own voice than let it be turned into a weapon of destruction. Yet the loss was more than material. Bells were sanctified objects, often named and blessed. To see them melted for war was sacrilege. Chroniclers describe villagers weeping as bells were hauled away, as if watching the soul of their community dragged to the foundry. And so we are left with an unresolved thought. When parishioners buried their bells in fields or lakes during the 30 Years' War, did they believe they would one day dig them up again? Or did they know, deep down, that silence might outlast their own lives? Asterisk, the 30 Years' War was not just a clash of faiths and dynasties, it was a war of supply. Soldiers needed food, wagons, powder, and above all, cannon, and cannon needed bronze. In an age before industrial scale smelting of iron for heavy artillery, bronze was the most reliable material for casting large guns. Its mixture of copper and tin gave strength and resonance, and Europe's armies consumed it in enormous quantities. Where was this bronze to be found? In the very towers and steeples of Europe's churches. Every town had bells. Every monastery had several. Every cathedral possessed great Borden bells weighing tons. To an army desperate for artillery, they were irresistible. The confiscation of bells became a routine part of war. Commanders issued decrees requiring towns to deliver their bells to foundries. Sometimes payment was promised. More often, it was simple requisition. Parish registers across Germany, Bohemia, and Austria record the grim notes, Anno Domini 1633. Our bell was taken for cannon, and since then no tolling for mass or burial. For villagers, this loss was profound. Bells were not inert bronze, they were companions in daily life. They called farmers from fields, announced curfews, marked prayers. Their tolling for the dead gave solemnity to funerals. Their joyous peals made weddings festive. Without them, life fell into a strange silence. Imagine a village wedding without a bell, or a burial carried out with only footsteps and shovels for sound. The response of communities was varied. Some complied reluctantly, seeing no way to resist. Others pleaded. There are accounts of villagers presenting petitions to officers, begging to keep at least their smallest bell for burials and holy days. Occasionally, such pleas were granted. More often, soldiers showed no mercy, but some communities turned to concealment. In regions of Saxony and Thuringia, chronicles speak of bells buried secretly in fields or woods, inverted so that their mouths were pressed to the soil. This made them difficult to haul away, even if discovered, and symbolically silenced them until peace returned. Lakes became hiding places as well bells lowered into water, where mud would swallow them. Folklore later claimed that these bells could still be heard tolling beneath the surface on feast days. Archaeology has confirmed parts of these traditions. Excavations in the 20th century uncovered bells buried during the war, some broken, others intact. In rare cases, bells were recovered soon after the conflict and rehung, their sound returning after years of silence. In many other cases, they were forgotten, their burial known only through legend. For rulers, bells meant cannon. For villagers, they meant identity. This clash was not only material, but spiritual. Bells were consecrated. They were baptized with names Samaria, Michael, Janand, inscribed with prayers. To melt them for war was, to many, sacrilege. Chroniclers describe tears as bells were hauled away, villagers kneeling as if at a funeral. One Saxon priest wrote, "The bell of St. Mary was taken. The people wept as for a mother, for she had called them all their lives, and now she will speak no more." The silence that followed reshaped daily rhythms. Without bells, time was kept by sundials, sandglasses, or the rough measure of daylight. Communities lost their common soundscape. The absence was most keenly felt in death. Without tolling, funerals felt incomplete. Some villages replaced bells with the beating of wooden boards or drums poor substitutes, but attempts to retain rhythm. In towns, the loss was political as well. City bells summoned councils, announced decrees, or warned of fire. Without them, civic order faltered. Some councils kept small handbells or trumpets for announcements, but the loss of the great Borden bells left public life diminished. The confiscation also had long-term consequences. When peace finally came in 1648, many towns were ruined. Recasting bells was expensive. Some parishes waited decades before they could afford new ones. Others never replaced what was lost. Even today, church towers in Germany and Bohemia sometimes lack their medieval bells, their silence a reminder of the war. The war left Europe dotted with legends of lost bells. In Bavaria, peasants told of bells hidden in mountains, their sound rumbling in storms. In Silesia, tales spoke of bells lowered into rivers, still tolling faintly underwater. These legends, while unprovable, reflect how deeply the absence of bells was felt. Communities could not accept silence. They imagined their voices still alive, waiting to return. What is most striking is the paradox of concealment. Burying their bells, villagers silenced themselves to deny their conquerors sound. It was resistance through muteness, choosing absence rather than surrender. The act carried both defiance and despair. A buried bell was safe, but it was also silent. The 30 Years' War ended with the Peace of Westphalia, but the silence endured. Many bells never returned. Some lay underground, forgotten. Others had been melted into cannon, their bronze blasted in sieges, scattered as shrapnel across fields. The voice of villages was turned into the roar of war, and so the question lingers when villagers buried their bells upside down. Did they do so in hope that one day the bell would be raised and rung again, or did they know they were committing it to a tomb, exchanging sound for survival? Asterisk. When the Peace of Westphalia was signed in 1648, Europe staggered out of 30 years of devastation. Cities lay in ruins, fields untended, and populations depleted. But in the quieter rhythms of parish life, another absence endured: the missing bells. Their loss was not as visible as ruined walls or burned farms, yet it was just as deeply felt. For many communities, bells were gone forever. Melted into cannon, their bronze had thundered across battlefields at Breitenfeld, Lutzen, and countless sieges. Villagers knew that the very sound which had once sanctified their marriages and burials had been transformed into instruments of death. The irony was bitter. The voice of prayer turned into the roar of war. Yet some bells survived, hidden during the conflict and rediscovered. In Saxony, there are accounts of farmers unearthing bells from fields decades later, rehanging them in wooden frames until towers could be rebuilt. In Westphalia, villagers drained a pond to recover bells lowered into its depths, their bronze still resonant after years in mud. Each recovery was celebrated with processions, blessings, and feasts. When such a bell rang again, it was more than men sounded was a declaration that life had returned. Still, the landscape of silence remained. In towns unable to replace bells, improvisation continued. Wooden boards struck with hammers, called clopsicans, became substitutes for tolling. Small handbells were rung at funerals. Some parishes borrowed bells from neighbors when possible. These makeshift measures reveal how essential sound was to ritual. Even in poverty, people sought ways to mark time and sanctify life. The memory of confiscated bells persisted in folklore. Stories of bells still ringing beneath lakes or fields spread widely. In Bavaria, villagers swore that at midnight on Christmas Eve, sunken bells could be heard faintly in the distance. In Bohemia, legends claimed that buried bells would rise when the world was at peace. tolling by themselves. These tales were less about literal truth than about cultural healing. They allowed people to imagine that silence was temporary, that their voice was waiting beneath the earth. The economic impact was lasting. Casting new bells was costly, requiring copper and tin at a time when trade was disrupted. Some parishes waited until the 18th century to replace what had been lost. Others never did. Even today, in parts of Central Europe, church towers stand with fewer bells than their medieval counterparts once held. The war reshaped the very soundscape of the continent. Culturally, the 30 Years' War reinforced the link between bells and vulnerability. Communities learned that their most treasured symbols could be stripped away. This memory lingered into later centuries, during the Napoleonic Wars, and again in the First and Second World Wars. Governments requisitioned bells for bronze, echoing the practices of the 17th century. Each time, people remembered stories of earlier confiscations, sometimes buried their bells once more. The ruin of bells in the 30 Years' War also invites reflection on resilience. Though voices were silenced, communities endured. Faith adapted, rituals adjusted, and new bells eventually rose in towers. Silence was never total. It was broken by memory, improvisation, and eventual renewal. Standing in a German village today, you may still see inscriptions on bells noting their casting after the war, or plaques remembering the loss of earlier ones. These are echoes of a century when silence was forced upon whole regions. And so the question remains, did the bells that were buried, confiscated, or destroyed truly vanish? Or do they still live in the collective memory of Europe, ringing invisibly? Not in towers, but in the stories told each time a new bell tolls across fields once emptied by war. Asterisk, to understand why some medieval bells remain buried to this day, you must first understand what a bell was in the Middle Ages, not merely an object of bronze, but a living part of the community. When a bell was cast, it was celebrated almost like a child's birth. Parishioners gathered as molten bronze was poured into a clay mold. Prayers were spoken, and incense was burned. Once cooled and hung in its frame, the bell was blessed with holy water and often given a name. Maria, Michael, Johannes. Inscriptions were carved into its bronze. Invocations for protection against storms, fire, or plague. Bells were believed to ward off evil, to drive away thunder, to calm the air itself. From dawn to dusk, bells ordered life. They rang the Angelus at morning, noon, and evening. They summoned workers from the fields to mass. They tolled for births, marriages, and deaths. To live in a medieval village or town was to live within a soundscape defined by bells. A terra absence was unthinkable, but bells were also vulnerable. They were valuable objects made of bronze at a time when metal was scarce. Each represented enormous communal investment years of donations, rents, and tithes, and because they hung in towers, visible to all, they were among the first targets in war. Armies confiscated them for cannon. Lords seized them to punish. Rebellious towns, invaders, looted them as trophies. This explains why bells were sometimes buried. To preserve them from enemies, parishioners would lower them from towers, dig pits, and hide them underground. Burial was both practical, denying access to their bronze, and symbolic silencing their voice until danger had passed. These bells were later recovered, but some were forgotten, their locations lost to memory. Over centuries, fields were plowed, forests grew, and ruins collapsed. The bells remained underground, heavy and mute. Legends about these lost bells abound across Europe. In France, peasants speak of sunken bells, heard tolling in rivers on holy nights. In Poland, tales tell of bells buried in marches that will rise again at the end of time. In Germany, villagers claim that during thunderstorms, underground bells vibrate faintly, reminding the living of their buried voices. But beyond legend lies archaeology. Excavations in churchyards, castles, and abandoned villages have uncovered bells that were indeed buried centuries earlier. Some were cracked, others intact, their inscriptions still legible. Each discovery is a window into a vanished soundscape, a reminder that silence can preserve as much as it destroys. The story of why some bells remain underground is thus not a mystery of chance, but of human choice. Communities buried their voices to protect them, but memory of the locations faded. Kin trying to save their bells, they consigned them to centuries of silence. And so we are left with an unresolved question. When villagers lowered their bells into the earth, did they imagine that their descendants would one day dig them up, or did they accept that the bells might never rise again? Their voices left to echo only in legend. Asterisk. Once a bell was buried, its fate depended on memory. If villagers survived war or plague and returned, the bell might be unearthed, cleaned, and rehung. But if a community was scattered, if records were lost, or if generations passed without need or knowledge, the burial site could be forgotten. Over time, the earth reclaimed its treasure. Examples of this pattern appear throughout Europe. In Bohemia, chronicles from the 17th century mention villagers lowering bells into marshes during Swedish raids of the 30 Years' War. Some were recovered after peace, but others remained lost. Centuries later, fishermen claimed to hear ringing from the water during storms, a sound explained not by physics, but by memory turned into legend. In France, villages devastated by the 100 Years' War left ruins where bells had been hidden. When people resettled centuries later, the exact sites of burial were unknown. Archaeologists excavating churchyards have occasionally struck bronze beneath layers of soil bells. It's cracked but still inscribed, their names and prayers visible after 500 years underground. In Ireland, monastic sites abandoned after Viking or Norman raids sometimes conceal bells within stone enclosures or bogs. These handbells, smaller than the great tower bells of the continent, were carried off and buried deliberately as relics, rediscovered in the 19th and 20th centuries. They are among the most significant early Christian artifacts of the island. The process of forgetting was simple. A generation might bury the bell in haste, assuming it would soon be recovered. But war, famine, or disease might kill those who knew the site. Oral tradition failed, or landmarks changed. A pit in a field became indistinguishable from the landscape. A mound in a forest was leveled by time. Without maps or written records, the knowledge vanished. Meanwhile, the community adapted to silence. New bells were cast when wealth allowed, replacing those lost. Churches built after wars did not always wait to recover old bells, but commissioned new ones, considering the buried ones gone for good. The soundscape resumed, but with new voices, leaving the older ones entombed. Folklore filled the gap left by forgetting. Stories of sunken bells became common across Europe. In Germany, peasants said underground bells rang at midnight on Christmas Eve. In Poland, said bells buried in fields would rise to the surface if plowed by a horse pure white. In Italy, legend spoke of bells sunk into rivers by invaders, their tolling audible to fishermen. These tales gave continuity, preserving memory and myth when the actual locations were unknown. Archaeology confirms some of these legends. Excavations in Saxony uncovered bells buried upside down, mouths packed with earth, their surfaces still bearing 17th century inscriptions. In Austria, workmen digging foundations in the 19th century found a bell lowered centuries earlier, its clapper removed to prevent accidental sound. In England, church renovations have occasionally uncovered medieval bells bricked into walls, forgotten by all but the masons who sealed them. What makes these burials striking is their double meaning. On one hand, They were acts of preservation aid to save bells from theft or destruction. On the other, they became acts of loss, consigning bells to silence longer than anyone intended. Communities sought to protect their voices, yet, in doing so, often ensured they would never be heard again. Daily life moved on, but traces lingered. Children played near mounds, sad to cover bells. Elders swore they had heard tolling beneath the ground. Farmers plowing fields sometimes struck metal and wondered if it was treasure or curse. Bells hidden for safety became bells of legend, their voices migrating from towers to stories, and so the question lingers. Did communities that forgot their own burials fail in their duty of memory, or did they, by turning bells into legend, give them a second life? One that still tolls quietly through imagination. Asterisk, the bells that remain underground today, whether truly lost in soil or remembered, only in legend speak to the persistence of memory as much as to the silence of bronze. They remind us that history is not always written in chronicles or carved in stone, but often buried, literally, in the earth. Archaeologists across Europe have occasionally brought such bells back to light. In Germany, excavations at abandoned villages depopulated during the 30 Years' War revealed bells still lying in pits, inverted and packed with dirt, some more cracked, others remarkably intact, their inscriptions as legible as the day they were cast. In Poland, peat bogs preserved smaller parish bells, green with patina, but still resonant when struck. In France, roadworks near ruined churches have unearthed bells forgotten since medieval wars, heavy reminders of vanished communities. Yet, for every bell recovered, many more remain hidden. The weight of bronze is immense. Some bells weighed several tons. To recover them required both memory and resources, both of which were often lacking in the aftermath of disaster. Communities moved on, built new churches, or cast new bells, leaving the buried ones behind. Over time, they ceased to be practical losses and became symbolic presences. Folklore ensured they were never entirely forgotten. In rural Europe, legends of sunken bells continue even into modern times. Peasants in the Alps tell of lakes that conceal bells, their sound said to roll from beneath the water at Easter. In Bohemia, stories persist of fields where underground bells ring when thunder shakes the ground. These tales are not literal descriptions, but cultural echoes, ways of keeping alive the sense that something valuable, something sacred, still lies beneath. The religious meaning of bells added weight to these stories. Bells were consecrated, named, and blessed. Their peals were thought to repel storms, banish demons, and sanctify the air. To imagine a bell buried was to imagine a holy voice silenced, yet not extinguished. Legends of underground tolling preserved. The belief that the sacred endured even when hidden. Daily life in villages, once marked by bells, often adapted to their absence, but not without loss. Timekeeping shifted to sundials, or simple reckoning by daylight. Funerals without tolling felt incomplete. Some communities substituted wooden clappers or drums, but these lacked the resonance of bronze. Silence became part of survival, but it was never embraced fully. The stories of lost bells show how keenly absence was felt. Even today, bells underground shape the way communities think about their past. In towns where legends of buried bells persist, local identity is tied to the idea of something hidden, waiting. Some have conducted digs, hoping to recover them. Others leave the bells where they are, accepting the silence as part of heritage. The unrecovered bell becomes not a failure, but a marker of endurance, proof that even in loss, memory survives. The persistence of these stories invites reflection. Is it better to unearth a buried bell, restoring its voice, or to let it remain underground, tolling only in imagination? Each choice shapes how history is remembered. through sound return to towers, or through silence that still resonates in legend? And so, the final question stands. Do the bells that lie beneath Europe's soil belong to the past, never to be heard again? Or do they still live in the present, ringing, not in towers of stone, but in the memory of communities that refuse to let silence have the last word?